With the Paris 2024 Olympic Games upon us, what better time to reflect upon the impact of the Olympics on urban life in the UK? The Games has been hosted in London in 1908, 1948 and 2012, with venues making their mark within and beyond London. It's been 12 years already since London 2012, and there's plenty to reflect on the impact that event had on the city. Welcome to the Oldie Guide, your podcast guide to the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. And this episode is an Olympics special. We're interrupting our usual guides to cities in the UK to focus on the legacy of the Olympics. I'm Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to welcome back historian and Olympics superfan, indeed superfan of all sports, it seems. Don't know how he does it, Daniel Gooch.
Nice to be back. Are you planning to watch much of the Olympics this year? Planning to go to any?
Oh, it'll be on TV, I'm afraid. I'd love to be there. So are you planning to go?
I wouldn't get away with it. I've spent much of the last month in Germany, having my heart broken by England again.
But you'll be watching from a distance, and of course you will be as fascinated as me by the transformation that we see in parts of Paris as a result of these games, because every Olympics Games always leads to some huge urban transformation in the cities that host. So Daniel, tell us what you want to cover today.
Not so much looking at the events, the winners, the stats, all that kind of thing, but more how they impacted on the areas they were held in Britain. For the 1908 Olympics, the first one that London hosted, this is mostly going to be looking at what was built, why it was built, and what's still there now. What can you still see? Because there is a bit of it still left. Whereas moving on to 2012, we're probably going to be looking less at specific venues. There'll be a bit of that, but more the broader legacy of regeneration and what were the what's the long-term legacy that's still there today and to plan for the future that's come out of that Olympics. And
this is important, right? This is big cities.
It is, and not just for urban history, but for sporting history as well. I mean, it's really important as a commemoration of these really important events in Britain's modern history. There's no national sports or national Olympics museum like you have in other countries, like the Netherlands has one, Germany has one. I've been to both. Those are fantastic. There's nothing like that in Britain. So it's almost like the physical legacies in London and beyond, plus some diffuse collections of artefacts in museums and collections elsewhere, are really the best way of memorialising Britain's Olympics.
Do you find much is written on this subject?
There are books dealing specifically with each of the Olympic Games, and a lot of them look at the events themselves. Some are like mini biographies of the individuals involved in the planning and organising. Some look at how the events were planned and staged. Rebecca Jenkins' book, The First London Olympics 1908, is a great example of how all these approaches are combined. I think my favourite, the most valuable resource, and one I've probably got to give a particular credit to, given how helpful it was from my research for this episode, is Martin Polly's The British Olympics. It's part of the English Heritage Series Played in Britain, which has now sadly ended. But that book in particular has meticulously investigated most of the locations used for the 1908 and 1948 London Olympic Games. You can still buy it for an absolute bargain, £5 on the Played in Britain website. So if you haven't got it, get one now.
I'll be on that website clicking away. Most of our listeners will remember fondly, I'm sure, of London 2012 Olympics, but it was 12 years ago, so we might have some listeners who don't remember it. But anyway, most people will remember that, and we might have some listeners who remember the 1948 Games. And so you're going to start off with some really interesting and surprising stats and histories of those older games, and then we're going to finish with a bit of a review on the legacy of the 2012 Games. So let's go back. London's hosted the Games three times: 1908, 1948 and 2012. It's the only city so far to have hosted it three times, although Paris will be joining London in that list. So let's go back to that first Olympics in 1908. What on earth was the planning like?
Very, very different from modern Olympics. This was only the fourth staging of the modern Olympics, unless you count the kind of semi-Olympics, the intercalated games in Athens in 1906. Very different. First in timing, because the planning stage was very short. It was only 2 years. The games were supposed to be in Rome originally, but Mount Vesuvius erupted, so Italy needed to divert funds to dealing with that. That's the official reason. Some historians are a bit cynical. They think perhaps that was a bit of an excuse to cover up some of the Italian infighting, which was derailing the hosting organisation there. But whatever the reason, London stepped in. London hosted its first Olympics in 1908. So 2 years only. Compare that with London's last Olympics in 2012. That took about 15 years of planning and construction in total. So very, very different timescales. There were very different priorities as well. There was no real concept of legacy in the planning of 1908. It was really, as one historian put it, a celebration of amateur sport, and that was it. There was no concept of urban regeneration, nor really any particular thought as to leaving even permanent sporting facilities behind. A final key difference in 1908 is that no public money was spent on the games themselves, as it's been said by many historians that the king himself made this a condition of giving his support to hosting the event. But this meant because there was no public money to be spent, the games were heavily reliant on existing private sporting clubs around London to host a lot of the events. That does mean that many of the venues used that still exist today don't really have much cause to see their Olympic legacy as an important part of the history, because it was just one part in their overall history, which has started before and went on afterwards. But nonetheless, some of them are still there today.
So what kind of legacies are we talking about here?
In organisational terms, the 1908 Games were hugely influential. Some call 1908 the first successful modern Olympics, and even some say the first modern Olympics, because several of the most recognisable elements of the Olympics stem from this Games. For example, gold, silver and bronze medals. Previously, there'd been no set system of medal colours, no set system for even who got them. It'd be first, second or third, first or second, just first. But here, that's when that tradition of the top three getting gold, silver and bronze medals became established. This was also the first Olympics where entrants represented their nations. Again, unless you count the intercalated games of 1906. Perhaps more importantly, this was the first Olympics to be filmed and the first to get widespread media attention, particularly through widely circulated photographic records. It was also the first Olympics to involve women, only 37 out of over 2,000 competitors, but nonetheless a really important step in the progression of the Olympics. And finally, crucially for our interests, it was the first Olympic Games to have a specific purpose-built Olympic stadium.
Now we're talking. What kind of stadiums did we have in England back then?
They were driven by the audiences and the context of British sport really as an urban spectacle, which is what we're interested in. Audiences for mass spectator sport in urban areas had really grown over the last half century. This was mainly for football, as you'd expect, often driven by local communalism centred on urban areas. You had teams growing from, for instance, church or works teams. One might grow to dominate, many might amalgamate to the point where there are often single clubs representing whole urban communities. And the facilities had grown likewise, from roped-off fields to banked earth terraces with covered stands. There were proper enclosed grounds with facilities where you could watch sport at this point. But crucially for this podcast, there were no stadiums in England at all, anywhere, which were ready to be the centrepiece for an event like the Olympics in respect of facilities, size or grandeur. In London itself, Crystal Palace, which was the stadium on the site of the current National Sports Centre, hosted the FA Cup final every year, and it was huge. It could hold well over 100,000 people. But in facilities, it was incredibly basic. It was really just a huge fountain in a public park that had been filled in 50 years before with a couple of wooden stands and some banks of earth dotted around it. You can see aerial views of that stadium, panoramic views which were taken at the time, and you really do see just how basic it was. So really nothing like ready to be the centrepiece of a modern Olympics Games. And this is where the White City Stadium comes in. The White City Stadium, which was the new stadium built for the Games. The stadium was built as part of the Franco-British exhibition, which was being held in West London to celebrate the recently signed Entente Cordiale agreements between the UK and France, which were a crucial point in the improvement of political and diplomatic relations between the two countries. The exhibition gave the White City Stadium its name because all the buildings were covered in white plaster. Hence, it was really a small white city. The area chosen for the exhibition and the stadium was previously brickworks and fields. And the exhibition itself really was pretty big. If you want an idea of its scale, look on Google Maps, trace a line just north of the BBC's old media centre, which stands on the site of the stadium, to just northwest of Queen's Park Rangers' current ground, Loftus Road, which was at the edge of the exhibition area. And you'll see there just what the scale was. Quite importantly, construction as part of the exhibition meant that the exhibition company paid for the stadium in return for a hefty chunk of ticket receipts, of course. But this did mean, as previously agreed, no public funds needed to be used for the construction of the stadium. The stadium itself took only 9 months to be built, and it cost less than £10 million in today's money, but it was still by far the most advanced stadium in London at the time. Rebecca Jenkins, historian of the 1908 Olympics, called it the greatest stadium in the world at that time. And depending on how you're looking at it, she may well have been right. It really was incredibly ambitious. It was well ahead of its time amongst British stadia. It held around 80,000 people, mostly seated, again, very unusual. And as well as being the first purpose-built Olympic stadium, it really was truly multi-purpose. The aim for the stadium was to hold as many events as possible there, including football, rugby, athletics, cycling, lacrosse, hockey and archery, all held in the stadium. And even sports that we think of as being purely indoor sports now were held in the stadium, like gymnastics and aquatics. Uniquely in Olympic history, the swimming pool was built into the infield of the main stadium, with swimming events being held there. It was a 100-metre pool, so double the current Olympic standard. And this was the first time that swimming events had been held in a stadium especially constructed for the Olympics. At the previous 3 Olympic Games, swimming events had been held in the sea, in a river, or an artificial lake. So this does represent another important legacy of the 1908 Olympics. Although it's got to be said, the swimming experiment wasn't an unqualified success. The summer of 1908 was very cold and wet, and the water was unheated, so it doesn't sound like a very pleasant experience. Plus, the mud from the infield meant the water got so murky that competitors could hardly see each other. One competitor even caught hypothermia, so wasn't great for all of them. But on the stadium itself, despite its grandeur, there was really no expectation that the stadium would remain for long after the exhibition. Yet it was just about the only stadium used in the games that did. It was used regularly for greyhound racing from 1926 onwards. It hosted a match in the 1966 World Cup, ironically here because Wembley was out of action because it was hosting a greyhound racing event that night. It also hosted Queen's Park Rangers for a couple of stints. It was only demolished in 1985 to be replaced by the BBC's new television centre, which remained there until just a few years ago. Finally, on the exhibition, the Franco-British exhibition, the one other legacy worth mentioning was Wood Lane Tube Station. This isn't the current Wood Lane station. It was on a different line, the Central Line, but it and a line extension were built to serve the Franco-British exhibition. You could actually still see the station building until the early 2000s. It was demolished to be replaced by the large Westfield shopping centre, which stands in that area now. So, like the stadium itself, the station stood for nearly a century, but unfortunately, nothing remains of it now.
Clearly some world firsts there, and certainly a dramatic impact on the urban fabric of London, which is still kind of seen in a way at White City in the fact that public and cultural buildings have persisted in that part of London, albeit on a very different guise today. You know, BBC Studios, which themselves have moved, the large shopping centre that's now in that area. What else was there away from White City?
So you had lots of private clubs, as we said, in the existing venues, which were utilised to host the Olympics. Many of these were used to avoid the expense of funding new facilities and, no doubt, to harness local expertise in the sports. Bisley Rangers was used for shooting. There's still a shooting facility there today. It was also used in the 1948 Olympics, as was the rowing course at Henley-on-Thames, used for both 1908 and 1948. Unfortunately, Henley couldn't complete the hat trick and be used for 2012, as you were no longer allowed to use natural rivers by that point. So the artificial Dorney Lake near Slough, near Eton, was used instead. Tennis was held at the All England Lawn Tennis Club, not the current site where Wimbledon is held, but their previous grounds on Warple Road, which they occupied until the club moved to the current Wimbledon site in 1922. As you'd imagine, the stands at Warple Road were much smaller than the large ones they have today. You can see lots of photos of them still. The club itself and the courts have been mostly demolished since then. They are now Wimbledon High School's sports grounds and an ambulance station. However, there is one important remnant. The All England Lawn Tennis Club's original original pavilion is still there. It's part of the school. The school's website says it contains a club room, classroom, kitchen and changing rooms. There's also a plaque on the wall of the sports ground marking the site and its use in the 1908 Olympics. Also on tennis, Queen's Club. Queen's Club hosted the other racket sports events, real tennis, racket and covered court tennis, which is kind of a form of indoor tennis. Not a success, though. These are hard sports to watch, and they didn't sell many tickets. I think it was only in double figures the number of tickets they sold for events there, so it didn't go well. But the courts are all still there, so another tangible remnant that you get today. Finally, on this area, Hurlingham Park. Hurlingham Park hosted polo, not the water variant this kind, the horsey variant. The club is still there. The polo ground is now not a polo ground, it's now Hurlingham Park, and it was sold to the council in 1951.
And where were the outdoor road races? So where was the marathon?
Oh, the marathon. This is a really interesting story. The marathon's route went from Windsor Castle up through Eton, Slough, through Berkshire, Middlesex, into London, finished at the White City Stadium. This route was organised, again, by a private club, Polytechnic Harriers, who chose Windsor as the starting point to give some historical gravitas to the event. There is a popular myth around this, that the race was supposed to be 26 miles, but lengthened either due to royal requests to start in the castle or royal requests to end at the royal box. But neither of these suggestions is true. The course length wasn't regular up to that point, and it was only lengthened for logistical purposes and to avoid a steep ramp at the stadium at the end, which I'm sure the competitors were very grateful of. There is one physical remnant today of the marathon, one original remnant, which is a distance marker on a wall in Eton High Street. It's a small metal sign pointing in the direction of Slough, reading marathon route 25 miles, 40.2 kilometres. There were distance markers placed every mile on the course originally. The location of the remaining markers is unknown, but this one is still there today. You can go to Eton High Street, you can see it now. And other than that, I suppose the one remnant is the route itself. You can still run the whole route on foot, subject to crossing a couple of motorways and crossing the central line, but you can still do it. I know you're into marathons. Have you ever run that or been tempted to?
No, it's not a route that I'd even heard of.
I've run bits of it. When I used to live in that area, I used to run down to Windsor. So yeah, a little bit of the route. I had no idea it was
different.
It is, yeah, much less.
Yeah, it's not completely different from what we would use today. And what about outside London or outside the southeast?
Outside the southeast, there was only one venue used. This was Hunter's Quay in Scotland. Yep. This was, as I said, the only Scottish venue, the only one outside southeast England, and it hosted sailing, specifically the 12-metre race. And the number of metres was a measure of the size of the boat, and I think 12 metres was the biggest measure at the Games. The reason it was used while all the other races were held on the Isle of Wight was because there were only two entries for the 12-metre race. They were both British boats, and they were both moored up that way on the Firth of Clyde. So it seemed more convenient to bring the Games to the boats rather than bring the boats to the Games. So it was a strange reason, but it does at least mean that Scotland got a taste of the Olympics. And I think to talk just finally about a couple of more remnants that are still there today. Coming back to London, Northampton Institute. The Northampton Institute was the predecessor of City University. It hosted boxing, with Britain winning gold in every event. The building which hosted the boxing is still standing, one of only, I think, 3 remaining venues in London from the 1908 Olympics. Boxing was held as part of a separate event, the Winter Olympics of 1908. This wasn't winter in the sense that we'd understand it today, of snowy and cold games. It was more an event held around October after a gap of a few months, with sports that fitted that winter weather better. The building that hosted the boxing is now part of City University. Its Great Hall is used for lectures, and this is the room in which the boxing was held. The building itself stands on the corner of Spencer Street and St John Street in Clerkenwell, so you can see it very easily. I suppose if you ask the university, they might let you go in if you ask them nicely, but yeah, it's still there. And finally, Preston Road, clay pigeon shooting, which they still had back then, was held at a venue at Preston Road, which isn't far from Wembley Stadium. The most interesting remnant still there today is the tube station, Preston Road, which opened to serve the location, though it has been relocated just slightly since. For me personally, I find it a great place to stop for a pint without crowds before England home matches, given how close it is to Wembley Stadium, and there's a pub just near there. So a personal thanks for me to the 1908 organisers for that remnant.
And to clay pigeon shooting.
No, I don't go I don't go for that. No, I don't think they
No
do it
longer an
anymore.
Olympic sport.
Plenty of shooting still there, though.
That's an incredibly thorough list of every remnant of the 1908 Olympics. Now, the 1908 Olympics, as you say, was the first that had a stadium, the first that felt like it developed a region of a city. By the time London hosted the Olympics in 1948, the Olympics had moved forward. You'd had the Amsterdam Olympics, which had its very famous stadium, the Berlin Olympics, renowned for its Olympic area. So by 1948, things had clearly moved on. So tell us a bit about the driving force behind the planning of the 1948 Olympics.
Coming so soon after the Second World War, I think you could sum it up in one word: austerity. 1948 is known as the Austerity Olympics today. The legacy of war hung right over the Games, and it influenced not just budgets and who was invited to compete, but the choice of venues as well. There were numerous military facilities that hosted sporting events, and athletes were even accommodated at RAF facilities in Uxbridge and West Drayton, plus an old army camp in Richmond Park. Even prisoners of war were used for some of the admittedly limited construction work. More broadly, the organisers mostly made do with existing facilities, from the 24-year-old Wembley Stadium as the main stadium for the Games, to those military facilities and other public venues, rather than engaging in new grand construction works. And Martin Polly's opinion is it's hard, therefore, to think of the 1948 Games as having a tangible legacy on the built environment of London. However, while they may not have prompted much construction, the fact they used existing and military venues does at least mean that lots of the venues still survive today. And despite these parsimonious foundations, the event was a success. It made a profit and was an important milestone for post-war international and sporting collaboration. It set out other milestones as well. A record 390 women, close to 10% of the overall number of competitors, took part, and it was the first to have a meaningful television viewership as well.
So let's talk about the buildings themselves. I guess we could start with Wembley Stadium, as you've mentioned it.
Yeah, Wembley Stadium. The stadium, of course, wasn't built specifically for the event, but one of the most famous parts of its surroundings was Wembley Way, which we'll all know, or Olympic Way to give it its proper name, was built specifically for the Olympics. If you haven't come across this before, perhaps if you're not familiar with Wembley Stadium, if you're from outside the UK, Wembley Way is this very long, famous walkway, very wide, which runs from Wembley Park Tube Station, where the majority of people, I think, will be taking public transport to the stadium, all the way up to the main entrance to the stadium at the other end. It's famous for views overhead before, say, major cup finals, where you have teams of fans of one team on one side, fans of another team on the other side, and mingling in the middle. And this very famous part of it was built specifically for the 1948 Games. It was the most expensive building project for the Olympics, and came along with an expansion of Wembley Park Stadium at the other end. The famous Wembley Tunnel, which you'd always see footage of in old cup finals, was added to, and the terraces were finally concreted, having previously been built simply of ash. A running track was laid. This was using cinders from coal fires in homes in Leicester. The running track was then dug up straight after the Olympics and relayed at a small sports ground in Leighton, which coincidentally became part of the 2012 Olympic Park. In respect of other remnants, although Wembley Stadium has since been demolished and rebuilt, Wembley Way is still there, albeit rebuilt after the construction of Wembley Stadium, a little bit tarnished, in my view, by the introduction of steps to replace the famous ramp up the top. I know there were good legitimate reasons for adding those steps, but I think it did look better as a one single continuous walkway. And although, as we said, the stadium has been rebuilt, the new stadium does contain a few artefacts from the Olympics. The pillar that held the Olympic flame, the only remaining Olympic flag from the stadium, and the two concrete rolls of honour that showed all the gold medal winners and used to be next to the Royal Box entrance at the old stadium. It's a little bit of a shame that those, plus some of the other important artefacts from Wembley Stadium's history, like the crossbar from the 1966 World Cup final, are placed either in or outside the hospitality section, where in some cases only corporate spectators are likely to see them on match days. I'm sure you can see them on a tour though, so until we get that National Sporting or Olympics museum, that's probably your best chance to see some of the remnants.
I think that museum was talked about. Well, the old Wembley Stadium and its famous Twin Towers is something a lot of people will remember. But the other venues from the 48 Olympics, there's still remnants around. What else have we got?
Military facilities, these are really important. There were several used in Aldershot. Aldershot was a really important centre of Olympic events in 1948 because Aldershot, home of the army in Britain, has plenty of decent military facilities to use. The modern pentathlon, which was an event appropriately designed to test the skill of the ideal late 19th century soldier, was held across military facilities around that area. Aldershot Central Stadium, which is now still there, and called Aldershot Military Stadium, was used for equestrian events. It was also later used for training for the 2012 Olympics by the British equestrian team there. The Aldershot Central Gymnasium, now the Army School of Physical Training, was used for modern pentathlon. Best of all, you can still go for a swim in Aldershot Lido, where the swimming for the modern pentathlon was held. I think they had to put a barrier up because it's quite an irregular shape. But yep, it was used, and you can still go for a dip there if you want to swim in a bit of Olympic history. The athletes' villages, we spoke about those earlier. The military facilities used to accommodate the athletes. Reportedly, a few checked into hotels on seeing the facilities on offer. So not everyone was happy with it, but at least they did the job for most people. The Army camp in Richmond Park had shared dormitories, housed nearly 1,500 male competitors during the Games. Housing all these people from different countries had some diplomatic issues given the context of war just 3 years before. The Italian competitors, for instance, who were invited to the Games, still had to be kept separate due to the legacy of the war. Richmond Park camp was cleared in the 1960s. The only thing you can still see today there is some steps, which were part of the park, some concrete steps leading up a small hill, which you might still be able to find if you go there today. There is one other remnant though. Someone bought one of the huts from the army camp and re-erected it on an allotment in Alric Avenue in New Malden, where last time I read it was still being used as a rifle club headquarters. So you might be able to get a glimpse of it there now. Other existing venues, Finchley Lido, back to swimming theme. Finchley Lido was used for some of the water polo matches, I think some of the preliminary matches. There is still a swimming pool on the site of Finchley Lido, but unlike the one at Aldershot, it is a rebuilt one as part of a new leisure centre. And then the Empire Pool, this is now Wembley Arena. This was used for swimming, diving, water polo and boxing. It was actually built for a completely different multisport event, the 1934 British Empire Games, but became the only venue to be used in both 1948 and 2012 when it was used for badminton in 2012. I think you came to that with me, didn't you? Early one morning, possibly after a late night of boxing.
I think so.
The swimming was hosted at the Empire Pool. This, again, represented an important milestone as it was the first time ever that an indoor pool, which we take for granted as a feature of the Olympics now, had been used for the swimming. The 1948 Olympics was the first time since 1939 that the pool in Wembley Arena had been used. It'd been a bit forgotten about since the start of the war. It was actually the last time ever that the pool was used. It was covered up and just forgotten about. But the name Empire Pool did continue for the building until it changed to Wembley Arena in 1978. The building is still there and still going strong. It's been refurbished. It's acquired a sponsored name, but it's easily recognisable, particularly from the outside and from the seating plan, as the same building that was used in 48. And another exciting one here, Herne Hill Velodrome was used for cycling. It's quite unique as one of the few 1948 Olympic venues still being used for sport, for the same sport it was specifically built for. It's one of the world's oldest existing velodromes, dating from 1891. The site was extensively refurbished in 2016. Although it does look great now, unfortunately we lost a couple of real icons during that refurbishment. The original 1891 stand and a small, very, very basic stand that was built specifically for the Olympics in 1948, which was the only proper spectator construction work built for the Games. There is no doubt, though, I have to concede, the velodrome does look a lot nicer now than it did before.
And it's remarkable. It's been there so long, it's still there and still being used.
Yes, absolutely. Have you had a ride on it?
I've not had a ride on it, but I've been past it a few times, looked in.
So let's move on to Empress Hall now. Empress Hall was in Earl's Court. This was next to the, I think much better known Earl's Court Exhibition Centre, which hosted events in 2012. I remember going to some volleyball there one evening, but the Empress Hall hosted gymnastics, boxing, wrestling and weightlifting in 1948. This was, again, the first time that gymnastics had been hosted indoors at the Olympics, as they have been at all Olympics but one since. Originally, the IOC wanted the gymnastics to be outdoors, as they had always been, at Wembley, on the pitch. But rain meant they had to move it somewhere else, and the Empress Hall was used. The facility was originally built as a theatre in the 1880s and then converted into an ice skating stadium in the 1930s. It's now been demolished and replaced by an office block, as I think has the Earl's Court Exhibition Centre next door. Final London venue we'll talk about, just very briefly, Haringey Arena. A bit of an odd choice. Haringey Arena, you might expect it to host something like boxing. It actually hosted basketball. And nothing there anymore, unfortunately. Its name does live on, though, in the Arena Shopping Park, which is up that way.
That's Sainsbury's. There are still remnants then, but I don't feel like there's as many remnants from your list of the 1908 Olympics as there is the 1948. The list almost seemed as long.
Oh, yeah, there's a few. I think possibly a bit more that's there in substance for 1948. You'd still have Herne Hill Velodrome. That's probably the main one, I think. Some of the minor ones in Aldershot. The difference, I think, for 1908, I don't think there's much that's actually there in full substance now. It's more bits and pieces of it. But yeah, Herne Hill Velodrome is definitely one to go to if you've got any interest in Olympic heritage.
And the site of Wembley itself, and you've spoken about it a lot, even though it wasn't developed for that Olympics, that became and still is a cultural and sporting part of London. It still is, like White City, a part of the city designated for that kind of activity.
Yeah, definitely.
Which brings us on to the latest part of London, which has become devoted to sport and culture, which is the Lee Valley at Stratford Olympic Park in East London. And this brings us on to 2012. Really, by 2012, the Olympics is just a completely different kind of event, vast in scale, one of the most expensive things that a country or a city can do. Tell us about some of the planning for the 2012 Olympics.
Yeah, you're completely right. The Olympics, by this stage, were no longer just about sport. By 2012, the world beyond sport had entirely different expectations on what the Olympics could achieve. As Rebecca Jenkins again said just before the 2012 Games started, the Olympics were no longer just a celebration of amateur sport. They are a development agency to regenerate mankind, crushed with a load of expectations. Land will be reclaimed, communities regenerated. We are promised a lasting legacy to benefit sport, the environment, and global community. I don't think I can sum it up any better than she did. And 2012 was tied completely into this. Ken Livingstone, who was Mayor of London when London won the Olympic bid, was quite candid that regeneration was his main motivation for winning the Olympic bid. He said in 2008, I bid for the Olympics because it's the only way to get the billions of pounds out of the government to develop the East End. I suppose the question arises, how did such a monumental change come about? It's been suggested this concept of a wider urban legacy for the Olympics started with transport work carried out for the 1960 Rome Olympics, which prompted the building of the first metro line in the city, which opened in 1955. But the following Olympics in Tokyo really cemented this concept of urban legacy and regeneration. The famous bullet train was launched to coincide with the start of the Olympics. There were multiple road and railway upgrades, and there was huge investment into airports, buildings, and other physical infrastructure. Even today, this legacy is studied and celebrated. I think there was a significant exhibition in London just a few years ago about the architectural legacy in Tokyo of the 1964 Olympics. It really was a major source of investment in infrastructure and the urban environment. And regeneration specifically has been a bigger priority for the IOC, especially since 2000. The Olympics have gone from often privately funded events with short planning and temporary venues to these massive publicly backed projects with planning and construction taking decades.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned Tokyo and Rome, because those two cities and those two countries, Japan and Italy, were experiencing their post-Second World War boom, the economic miracles in those countries. And in a way, the Olympic Games heralded the arrival of these rebuilt and highly industrializing countries in the post-war era. Let's talk a bit about the 2012 Games itself. Let's talk about the venues. So many new venues were built, but also many existing venues are built.
Yeah, unlike 1948, again, a contrast here, there was significant construction of new venues for 2012. And unlike 1908, the venues and infrastructure were publicly financed, with Parliament giving the cost of both of these at £5.3 billion. A notable feature of the construction of the Olympic Park, which we'll talk about more broadly in just a few minutes, I think, was how many temporary venues were built, which were intended for reuse elsewhere. Lots of venues were made from PVC to create what one of the organisers called big tents, making them easy to construct and reusable. The organisers were not just looking at sustainability here, but also hoping to avoid the legacy of white elephant venues from previous Olympics. The water polo arena is a great example. Bits of this have been sent to Sochi, a velodrome in Jakarta, and a truss was even installed as part of a TV gantry at Crystal Palace's ground, Selhurst Park. The Aquatics Centre, this was in the planning even before the Olympic bid was won, so that those funny wings were added. The temporary seating was added as huge wings which jutted out of the building at angles. Very distinctive style then. The basketball arena, another one that we went to, this was also temporary. Although it was big, although the capacity was in 5 figures, it was still just a completely temporary arena. And at one point, there was consideration given to shipping the whole thing over to Brazil and using it at the next Olympics 2016. Although temporary, the cost of the venue was still pretty high. It cost £40 million, not cheap. One interesting point around it is the colour of the seating. It was black and orange. This seems to have been because of an arrangement to sell the seats afterwards to Barnet FC after the Olympics for installation at their new stadium, which was built shortly afterwards, the Hive in just to the north of London. This has been recorded many times. I've looked and I've looked and I've looked. I can't find any absolute proof of this, but the company that built the basketball arena is exactly the same one that built all those prefabricated stands at the Hive. Having sat in both, I can say the seats are definitely of a very similar style. So I'm saying not a myth. I reckon that's true.
It's not 100% crystal clear. Maybe someone can let us know. Now, that venue had an incredible atmosphere, despite being a temporary venue. It had but I suppose, like, thinking of temporary venues, I remember the water polo arena very well. But even the Olympic Stadium itself had elements that were temporary.
Yeah, this is clearly the biggest single sporting artefact of the Games. It was never completely intended to be a totally temporary venue, but it definitely had and still has this kind of transitory prefabricated feel about it. Now, this is because although the lower tier and the stadium bowl itself were tended to be permanent, the original plan was to take most of the stadium above that down, almost all the seating, and repurpose it as a small athletic stadium to replace the National Sports Centre at Crystal Palace. It was realised at some point that athletics couldn't really justify a stadium like that, so Plan B was put together to rent the stadium to a football club. And Tottenham Hotspur expressed some interest, but West Ham won, and they moved in. They've done a bit of work to it, and they've since renamed the stadium London Stadium. Despite the presumptuous name, you've probably got to be said, it offers by far the worst viewing experience of any football stadium in the Premiership, if not the country. Fans in the lower tier walk across a prefabricated bridge over the running track, sit on temporary seats plunked next to the pitch. If you're in the upper tier, in 3 of the stands, you might as well bring binoculars, quite frankly. And that's even before you get into the financial mess this created. And the additional conversion costs of the stadium still cost taxpayers money to operate thanks to the rental agreement. It really compares unfavourably with a very similar project from just a few years before, the City of Manchester Stadium, which was used for the 2002 Manchester Commonwealth Games. Now, this was planned from the start to be converted to football. The project was to take away one temporary stand, dig down, have an extra lower tier next to the pitch. And really, that's been a tremendous success thanks to the foresightedness of the organisers there.
One of the frustrations about that 2012 conversion is everyone knew that it's a challenge to convert from athletics to football. It's well known. A missed opportunity, perhaps, but also perhaps just a difficult square to circle, because London had its national football stadium at Wembley, which was relatively new, and we judged, despite that being originally designed to accommodate an athletics track, because we had to have the Olympic Park in the Lee Valley, we couldn't use Wembley for the athletics.
Wembley Stadium was built with the theoretical possibility of adding a running track, but I think it has to sit on a platform, so no one's ever bothered to use it, and it's unlikely it would ever happen.
And it would cost millions to do it.
And it would reduce the capacity to probably an unacceptably low level. You'd have to cover up most or all of the lower tier. But I suppose we at least get the pleasure of the sightlines next season with Ipswich. I look forward to it nonetheless.
Well, we're going to finish off the episode by talking about the legacy of the Olympic Games on London's urban landscape. And I know we've both got some reflections. As the Paris Games commence, the 26th of July, 2024, I think it is timely to start reflecting on this, because it's been 12 years for the London site to bed into its urban context, and we can start to judge it alongside those historic locations that you've talked about at White City and Wembley, but also other parts of London and cities in Britain that have hosted major events. Places like North Greenwich, for example, which is part of a celebration of British culture at the millennium, the South Bank in London, Festival of Britain. How can we judge now whether the Lee Valley is transforming into a thriving district? And there are three real themes of the legacy of the London Games for me. The first is iconic architecture. The second is infrastructure, which is primarily transport. And the third is this regeneration of. And these themes reflect changes in other Olympics that you've mentioned, going back to 1908, but particularly evident since the 1920s, but also evident in other major games events such as Commonwealth Games. Starting with iconic architecture, you've Zaha Hadid's Aquatics Centre, which you've mentioned. It has an undulating roof, and it transformed access to Olympic standard swimming and diving facilities in London. The Velodrome, which was designed by Hopkins architects, features a roof which mirrors a bike wheel's geometry, while Popper Box and the stadium, which you've talked about, arguably offer a more functional appearance, but nevertheless of interesting design. The stadium's more parsimonious design reflects the deliberate intention of the Games to be of a smaller footprint. This contrasts with the 114-metre high orbit tower, which was designed by Anish Kapoor, and is this big red twisting mass of steel, which was added late in the design process. It's contrasts, and it does quite the opposite to the stadium, which is renowned for its light roof. The architecture of the 2012 Games is generally concentrated on the Olympic Park in the Lee Valley. Many venues were used around London in photogenic locations like Horse Guards Parade and Greenwich, but new venues were not built for those, and other sites for the Olympics were existing facilities like the O2 XL. So really those are the big architectural standouts. Alongside them now, we're seeing new ambitious architecture being delivered. So the University of Arts London, University College London have added a hint of brutalism. The V&A have got another interesting building alongside those on the East Bank. And arguably, this has given an opportunity for architectural expression more space than other regenerated parts of London like Nine Elms. And I think this architecture reflects the variation in British architecture that we see in the 21st century, just as other games have reflected the national mood. We mentioned Amsterdam showcasing the brick and masonry Amsterdam style, or Berlin style arguably reflecting the political climate, and Beijing's bird nest exemplifying China's ambition, innovation and scale. You feel London's architecture, London 2012's architecture, it's more varied and more messy. It's less monolithic, less organised, yet it seems to work. And maybe that's just how British cities' architectures are. They're just more jumbled. Look at the skyline of the City of London, for example. It's just a bit of a jumble of different styles.
One thing about the architectural style, I suppose the general design feel of the Games, from the logo to the branding, as it all fits into this, do you think it's aged well? Do you think it looks perhaps a bit dated even just 12 years on?
It's amazing how things start to look dated about 12 years on. And I know what you mean about the logo and the branding. It's starting to get that. I suppose the way to answer that question is to look at other things that that old, and how does it compare with those? I think you're right about some of those elements. I think the buildings are standing up well. I regularly use the Aquatics Centre, and I still think it's one of the most staggering public buildings in London. One of the things I love about that building in particular is how accessible it is. And that's true of many of the Olympic venues. But yes, it's a good question.
I went to an event at the Copper Box a few months ago. It did strike me coming out of there in the evening. This place is lovely, but it feels very planned. You don't get a sense that it's organic. You do still get that sense that it's planned. You do have these huge, wide roads sweeping through the area that you have to cross through or go around. They do seem to cut it up a little bit. And I know they were built for a good reason. You had to have accessibility around the venues very, very quickly. That was a condition of hosting the event. But do you agree with that? Or do you think there is an organic feel to it?
I think there are elements of the park that are starting to bed in. The plants are taking over. People are starting to make their mark. It's getting a bit scruffier. It's getting like a human feel to it. But there's other bits, just dominated by roads. If you think of the Olympic Park, it's kind of got an upper level, physically a few meters above, and then a lower level. And that upper level is dominated by hard surfacing. But then you're absolutely right. You've got these fast roads crisscrossing. Some of them are fast and not very well used. And it's because of that requirement for access. But I wonder if some of those roads could have been rethought through in legacy mode, which I think brings me on to like the second big change that comes out of an Olympic Games we saw in London, which is infrastructure. You've mentioned a bit of this in other cities. In London, the most visible example of that was the cable car, which goes 90 metres above the Thames at Norwich. That's the most visible sign. It's not the most useful piece of transport for most people today, but it did connect the North Greenwich Arena and the ExCeL Centre during the Olympics. But it's actually the less dramatically obvious transport legacies that have had more impact on the city. The renewal of a series of neglected surface railway lines, now known as London Overground, that was accelerated for the Olympics with its lines connecting key venues, including Olympic Park at Stratford. And London Overground really has made a big impact on many parts of the city, such as Dalston, Hackney and Hackney Wick. The Docklands Light Railway was extended with a second route to Stratford. This provided more connectivity within Newham, which has been a lasting legacy. And High Speed 1, which is the high-speed line between St Pancras and Paris, that has a stop in Stratford. And as part of the Olympics, you could go between Stratford and Olympic Park in minutes. That's still there. It would have been there anyway, but it's arguably a tangible legacy. But there's softer legacies within transport that are still used today. So when London Transport was planning the games, a new group was set up, a new board to try and influence how people travel around the city, and that's called travel demand management, and that's still used in Transport for London today. There was a huge investment in reliability and driving up capacity on the lines serving Stratford. Indeed, there was a train every 13 seconds to Stratford Station, adjacent to Olympic Park. So like many cities before, you've mentioned Rome, you've mentioned Tokyo, London used the Olympics to upgrade its transport network, but not in anywhere near as dramatic a way as those cities, probably because the transport network is arguably there in the first place. But there are definitely examples of that improvement. But even Mexico City led to a new metro system. I think Montreal led to 20 kilometres of new metro. We didn't get that.
As you said, you're starting from a different base, aren't you? For Rome, that was literally the first metro line ever built for the city of Rome, as astonishingly as it sounds, 1955, no good century after most comparable European capitals had already started building. I just wanted to ask about the Airlink, really, because I'm interested in it. It looks cool, but I've never been on it. I've never felt like I had any cause to go on it. On the scale from, essential infrastructure, couldn't do without it, to white elephant, where do you think it sits?
Unfortunately, I think it sits towards the white elephant, but I will qualify that. It does connect two areas of rapid growth that ought to be connected and provides resilience to North Greenwich, which otherwise is a relatively isolated point. It has a Jubilee line station and lots of buses, but it does stick out. So it has its uses. But I think the nuance to this is not so much, is it a useful connection? I think it is a useful connection. But would you have done it what's the opportunity cost of doing that investment? And it was £60 million over other pieces of transport investment. And I think that's where Olympics as a means of justifying investments becomes controversial. Some of these things might be good ideas, but are they the ones with the best business cases? Possibly not.
Interesting. I will at some point take my children on it, but that's the only use I could ever see for it. But yeah, if other people have use for it, great.
It has very good views. I recommend a ride. Stunning views. But
I'll do it. Sold.
Onto that question of like, is this the right thing to do? I want to talk about the third theme and come in here. And this is about that park itself. And this is, as you said, the purpose of getting all this public investment in. And this area of the Lee Valley, the design, the park design has to contend with this complex urban landscape marked by centuries of industrial use, dirty industrial use, and network of railways, roads, and waterways. It was originally marshy, so that's how it became this centre of light industry. And so it was a very difficult site to deal with. Redevelopment required a huge decontamination program, 2.3 million cubic meters of soil, and then lots of civil engineering, 11 highway bridges, 13 pedestrian bridges, 6 underpasses, all cost a lot of money to bring this site into a condition that could be used. But what you see now is large amounts of open space. We've talked about the hard surfaces, but there are lots of gardens. There's great variety in the gardens, great variety of planting. There's wetlands. And this is a real contrast to the classic Victorian parks of London, which are open, grass dominated. They might have an arboretum. The Olympic Park is different. It's more undulating. It's like a giant Mile End Park, which was developed a few years before. So it's quite unique in that sense. The other key development around the Olympic Park was around housing. Fewer houses have been delivered than were promised. So I think the former Athletes Village, which hosted 11,000 athletes during the Games, is now known as East Village, and that comprises of 2,800 homes. And I think there were plans throughout the Olympic Park for there to be 9,000 homes, and it looks like we're going to get 6,000. How many of those homes are affordable? Not as many as people would like. On the East Village, it does appear that 50% are affordable, but the definition of affordable is debated. Is shared ownership truly affordable?
There was a Guardian report into this, one of their long reads, which suggested that they thought 13,000 homes had been built, but only 11% were in any way affordable for anyone on the average local income. They quoted local residents who themselves weren't happy with the changes that had been made by the Olympic Park. And there's one local charity worker who said they brought a new community in, and they're the ones reaping the benefits. The legacy of the Olympics has just meant gentrification on an industrial scale. So there really is this question, I think, of whether the housing has really benefited existing residents or just wealthy people from outside, and property speculators, given it not just the cost of new housing on the site, but also the increase in surrounding land values due to the regeneration. So yeah, it's definitely a story of differing views there.
But this is always the story: regeneration, gentrification, displacement, and it's displacement of businesses as well, which is really difficult. So all those warehouses, waste disposal businesses, they can't be there anymore. They have to be somewhere. And when you look at Paris 2024, it's aiming to do the same thing. It's aiming to rejuvenate a quarter of Paris near Saint-Denis. That's the aim. But how do you do this transformational change in a way that reduces that level of displacement? For what it's worth, I think the housing areas around Olympic Park are really well designed. I think the East Village itself is of a density we should see more of in British inner cities. And then it gradually fades into terraces at Cobham Manor, into the area around the velodrome, which is more family housing. Where I'd wrap up Olympic Park, and I think we saw this in Manchester as well. To do the Olympics, you had to do this massive decontamination project. To do the Commonwealth Games 2002, there was a similarly massive removal of the Bradford colliery. And it's hard to think of how you do these large-scale changes without the political impetus of hosting a major games. And if you think even within London, central London sites like Battersea Power Station and King's Cross took years to redevelop, and they're in central London. It's just hard to see how the Lee Valley would ever have been able to be decontaminated, to have the infrastructure built without the impetus of the Games.
Comes back exactly to what Ken Livingstone said, doesn't it? That's the way to get the money in.
So what are your thoughts? What are your overall thoughts on the legacy of the Olympics on urban life in Britain?
I think it's early to say for 2012. I think for the two earlier ones, it really is just what can you still see today? I think Marcin Poli was right. For 1948, there definitely wasn't this concept of broader generation. For 1908, you could see a little bit of it in the White City Stadium and this, as you said, broader cultural space that's evolved in that area. But I don't think there's all that much to see for those two events other than the tangible remnants, the stadiums like Herne Hill, those museum pieces that are scattered around. I would really love to see that National Olympic Museum. I thought that'd be wonderful to bring all these things together. I think 2012 is by far the more interesting one. And I suppose we're lucky enough that we're going to get to see how it all plays out in our lives. There might be people interviewing us in 50 years about the time we went to the 2012 Olympics and what it's done to London since.
So thank you, Daniel, and thank you, our listeners, for listening. We continue with our mini-series on the fantastic city of Liverpool, and we're halfway through those episodes, so look out for those. And on the horizon, we have trips to Peterborough.
And I've got a very exciting trip coming up. I've got a week's holiday in York next week, so I cannot pass up the opportunity to do that one. It's a big one.
Looking forward to York greatly. And we still have 2 more episodes on Liverpool to go, so stay tuned. Thank you for listening to Yoldi Guide. Details of all our episodes can be found at yoldiguide.com, where you can leave comments, questions, or anything you like, really. Please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify, or tweet us at Yoldi Guide. Regular listeners may notice we use Ralph Vaughan Williams' English folk song suite for our intro and outro on Yoldi Guide. To celebrate the Olympics, we will instead today end with a section of the same composer's suite on Wenlock Edge, which puts to music the poems of A. Houseman's poems about the environs of Much Wenlock. This picturesque Shropshire town is the birthplace of the Wenlock Olympic Games, which started in 1850 and were an inspiration for later Olympics, and gave the name Wenlock to one of the mascots of the 2012 Games.
Wenlock Edge, the woods in trouble, his forest fleece the reeking heaves, the gale it flies the saplings double, and thick on 7 snow the leaves. And hang on when you're the call.